We're going to start by just defining what mental imagery is. We just had Nadine talk a little bit about it, but we're going to define mental imagery as any perceptual representation that is not directly triggered by sensory input. This notably differentiates it from vision and other forms of perception, which are usually heavily conditioned on external signals from the retina. So to get a feel for this, I want everyone in the audience to just do a little exercise with me. I want you to fixate on this image of a surfer and just memorize it. So I'll give you a few seconds here. And I'm also going to take it away for a few seconds. We're going to allow your conscious perceptual representation of the image from seeing it to fade. And now the fun part. I want you to imagine the image, projecting it into the empty space where that surfer used to be. Now, during this exercise, you can note how your mental image feels, how your conscious experience of it is maybe different than seeing the image previously, but it's still related to the original stimulus. Now, I want everyone to take a second and just appreciate how tremendously interesting what you just did was. I mean, using nothing but a recollection pulled from your short-term memory, you were able to create a conscious perceptual representation that was completely self-contained in your conscious experience, that was not externally accessible. Of course, there's a wide variety of mental images in the audience today. I don't want to disparage sort of the differentiation in subjective conscious experiences here, but everyone's conscious experience was related to that image. And while some of you may have had a very vivid mental image, the hyperphantasics of you, and some may not have been able to generate a mental image at all, the aphantasics, most of you were probably able to get at least a fuzzy picture of what I had you memorize. But the core question we're going to ask today is, how can we study these mental images, and can we extract them from the brain? Can we decode them and get that content out to be a useful representation of the original mental image? So to get some background on this from the neuroscience perspective, vision and mental imagery share a distinct neural code. So this figure here is some flattened cortical maps of brain activity, with activity highlighted during seeing natural scenes on the top and imagining natural scenes on the bottom, with the signal-to-noise ratio indicated by the shade of purple in this case. So the fact that there's measurable signal in the same areas of the brain shows a lot of promise for being able to decode mental images, but the much lower SNR, inspired by this lighter blue color, indicates that it will probably be quite difficult as well. So to explore this, we're going to tackle a number of research questions today, addressing a set of current unknowns in the field of mental imagery research. So we've seen a number of recent advancements in vision decoding, so we want to know whether these new vision decoding models will generalize to mental imagery. We also want to know whether the difficulty of decoding those imagined complex images might be related to the stimulus complexity, and whether the difficulty of imagining a complex image like the surfer earlier is going to hinder our decoding performance. We also want to know whether current improvements in vision decoding will correlate with a subsequent improvement in performance for imagery decoding. In other words, as these vision decoding models keep getting better, will they scale to mental images as well? And one of the reasons we're so excited about trying to decode mental images is because of these recent advancements in vision decoding. Decoding pipelines typically look something like this. First, we'll show a human subject a number of images under fMRI and record their brain activity. We'll then train a neural network to map from their brain activity to some feature embeddings of pre-trained foundation models. The fire icon here in this indicator just means we're training this decoding network, while that snowflake icon means that the embeddings we're mapping to are produced by frozen, pre-trained models open in the machine learning community. We can then pass those decoded embeddings into a diffusion model. This is a model that makes images out of text or other inputs. You can think of DALL-E or Stable Diffusion. And then that produces our decoded image reconstructions on the right. So the images in this figure here are real vision reconstructions. So if a subject sees that image of a clock tower on the left, we can record their brain activity, decode it into these latent vectors, and reconstruct it into that very similar looking clock tower on the right using a diffusion model. This has become extraordinarily effective in the last year or two due to the combination of large-scale fMRI data sets, much like the natural scenes data set is what's used for this work, which was collected in my lab. And we have tens of thousands of images shown to subjects under fMRI now, and that kind of scale has had a big impact in being able to do this work effectively. We've also seen the open release of extremely useful deep learning models in the last couple of years, such as CLIP and Stable Diffusion, which have allowed for new possibilities in both creating images and just representing this type of semantic information in new ways. So researchers utilizing these advancements have been able to build a number of state-of-the-art models for decoding visual perceptual states using NSD. And of course, My background's in computer science. I love nerding out about this type of architectural stuff, so if anyone's into that, come find me after the talk. But we can show a more comprehensive set of vision reconstructions from both my previous work and also recent literature in the field. On the top row of this figure are the ground truth stimulus images that the subjects saw in the scanner. Each of these other rows below them corresponds to a different variant of a vision reconstruction method that fits the general formula I outlined a few slides ago. And every one of these columns is just corresponding to reconstructions of that ground truth stimulus on the top row. So as we can see, methods that utilize this general framework produce reconstructions of incredible accuracy, which has us really excited about trying to use these models to decode mental images. So when decoding mental images, our framework is going to remain pretty much exactly the same, except we're going to be using the frozen model that we already trained for vision, so that first model is frozen now. We're also going to replace our inputs, our brain activity recorded during vision, with brain activity recorded during mental imagery. So a subject will imagine this image of a surfer on the left, much like you all just did. We'll record their brain activity, and we're going to decode it to those same latent vectors, and again use a diffusion model to reconstruct that image of a man doing a suspicious surfing-like activity. And this framework is going to allow us to test our first core question of how well these vision models will generalize to mental imagery. So to examine that quantitatively, we're going to be looking at a held-out, unreleased scanning session of the natural scenes dataset, in which the same subjects performed matched vision trials and imagery trials for a small set of 12 stimuli, where they memorized the images and then imagined them on command for our imagery trials, much like we all just did at the beginning of this presentation. So the stimuli we're using consist of 6 simple stimuli consisting of bars and crosses, and 6 complex stimuli containing natural scenes, like the natural scenes dataset, as well as 1 artwork by Kehinde Wiley. Now these are much more complex to imagine in detail, as we all experienced firsthand. So here are some example reconstructions from the matched vision trials of this data set. For those complex stimuli, reconstructions are largely matching the performance of the original natural scenes data set, but for the simple stimuli, we're reconstructing images with strong orientational information, but that contain largely meaningless semantic details. We think this might be a consequence of the training prior for our model, as we trained it on only natural scenes, as well as the priors of the diffusion model and these other pre-trained embeddings, which are also typically trained on images containing primarily natural scenes. Here's that same grid, but in this time we're displaying the mental imagery reconstructions. So at a glance, these appear qualitatively a little bit worse than the vision reconstructions, which we expect given the much lower SNR for mental imagery. But this figure can be a little bit hard to see, so let's zoom in on a few. These are a selection of some of the best reconstructions for the simple stimuli. Reconstructions here are really faithful to the ground truth orientation information, although we do typically struggle with the crosses in this case. Here are some of the best complex stimuli reconstructions. Now, for these, we're getting broadly correct image categories with information that clearly reflects the imagined content for the majority of the subject's mental images. Now, don't get me wrong, there's clearly weaknesses in the decoded outputs. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a bird that looks like that. But on the other hand, we have images with distinct representations of decoded imagined content. We are literally reading the subject's mind. I mean, we get multiple pastries for the donut images. The pose of the surfer is very close. We have 2 distinct boat-like objects in the water for the other image. And we're generally getting generally very good and distinct reconstructions. And our models are clearly generalizing. So that answers our first open question, as we can clearly see that this recent wave of models trained exclusively on vision data does generalize robustly to mental imagery. So moving on to our second question. We examined reconstructions with a behavioral experiment to look at some of these differences between the simple and complex stimuli. So our first experiment asked some human raters, which we recruited online, to identify which of 2 reconstructions was more similar to the stimulus image, with one being an actual reconstruction and one being a random reconstruction of a different stimulus. So I'd love for everyone to do this task with me in the audience. So which one of these looks more like the ground truth image outlined in red? Why don't you raise your hand for the left image and for the right image? All right, looks like most of you are spot on. The right one's definitely identifiable as donuts, or at least some kind of pastry in this case. So we're going to quantify this and how our human raters did by identifying and using a cumulative distribution plot. So for this plot, the x-axis is representing different accuracy thresholds, and the y-axis is the cumulative % of our reconstruction samples that have reached that threshold. And we have a null distribution in the middle here. So just to break it down, if we have an example point, Sorting our complex vision data and taking a sample around the 18th percentile or so, we can see that samples in this percentile are being identified correctly about 85% of the time, which is really good. We can expand that out to a full curve, and for this case, a lower area under this curve is better. And we can see that complex vision reconstructions are performing extremely well, which we expect given that this is the use case that these models were trained for. Complex mental imagery reconstructions also do quite well and are well above chance, but most interestingly, mental image reconstructions of simple stimuli are significantly worse. And even reconstructions of simple images that were seen during vision are still underperforming those of complex mental images. So we think these results demonstrate pretty clearly that reconstruction methods are generalizing better to mental images than they are to the simple stimuli, which were out of distribution for the training data of our reconstruction methods. So in this case, the complexity of our stimuli is clearly not the most important factor limiting our performance, which answers our second question. Moving into our last research question for today, we conducted another experiment to examine the relationship between vision and imagery reconstructions more directly. This experiment asked human raters to rate on a continuous scale how similar reconstructions of vision and imagery were to the stimulus image. So we're trying to aim to compare the relative performance of our reconstruction methods between these two visual modalities. This one's harder to do live, but a typical response might look something like this, with the reconstruction that actually contained faces in the frame maybe being a little higher rated. Now, to examine the results of this experiment, we're going to see how these similarity scores are related between vision and imagery. So for this plot, the x-axis is going to represent the similarity scores for our vision reconstructions, while the y-axis is going to represent similarity scores for imagery. So again, an example point might look something like this. We have an average vision score of around 0.25 and imagery for 0.1. Now, note the colors now are representing different reconstruction methods, so we can see how well it's generalizing across methods. But plotting the rest of the points for this first reconstruction method, we can see a pretty clear trend, and these point clouds are pretty consistent across the other reconstruction methods as well. We can also plot the average scores for all of the samples in our data set for each method, and in this case, these bolded points are tightly clustered. And if we fit lines to these point clouds, we can see that most of the fitted lines have a positive slope that is more or less equivalent. A higher slope here represents better generalization performance between vision and imagery. And if we average across those four methods here with robust imagery scaling, we can observe an average correlation coefficient of 0.56, indicating that on average, our mental imagery reconstructions are over half as accurate as seen image reconstructions, and also that they're significantly correlated. So that answers our last question, showing that samples that reconstruct well for vision are also reconstructing well for imagery, and that they're strongly correlated, indicating hopefully that future advancements in vision decoding as this field continues to grow will hopefully translate to mental imagery data as well. Now, I'm sure you can all think of a million applications, good or bad, for this technology. We're currently thinking about how it might be used in the clinic. As for the 50 million unresponsive patients with traumatic brain injuries that are admitted to the ICU every year, recovery of consciousness is a key milestone that predicts recovery. So if we could use this tech to decode imagined content and affirm consciousness, we could potentially prevent conscious patients from being taken off of life support, which is how 70% of these patients die in the hospital. Of course, there's a number of limitations to overcome before we get there. NSD imagery is extremely small, and we need more mental imagery data. We also need to develop better protocols for collecting that data, as we're currently constrained by the number of stimuli that a subject can memorize prior to an experiment. And we also need to work on generalizing these models to new subjects, as it's extremely impractical to collect 40 hours of fMRI data for every subject that we want to reconstruct from. Now, with all of that said, I think this is an incredibly promising and exciting area of research, and I'd like to thank the authors of all of the various publications that released in their open source reconstruction methods. There's a lot of open science effort in this field, and for that I'm very grateful, as we can evaluate them all for this work and get some interesting stuff. So you should definitely check out these methods if you're interested in this research. That's all I have for you today, so thanks for listening, and I can take questions.